Welcome to Readings and English, the channel where learning English becomes an exciting journey through stories. We all know that learning a new language comes with its own set of challenges and adversities. From the confusion of grammar rules to the embarrassment of mispronunciations, the road to fluency can feel overwhelming. But here, through carefully crafted and engaging stories, you learn English in a fun, immersive, and effective way. Each story is designed not only to teach, but also to inspire, showing that with patience and practice, you can overcome any hurdle. Today's story is about a young learner's journey, told through his diary. In each entry, he shares his experience of learning English, capturing both the struggles and the joys along the way, from funny moments like grammatical errors that made him laugh, to times of frustration, and finally those small but significant victories like successfully ordering food without hesitation. Let's dive into his story and discover how he turned challenges into triumphs. Chapter 1. The sky was a dull gray as I sat by the window, the journal open in front of me, its blank pages staring back like a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I hadn't kept a diary since I was a child, but today felt different. It was as if I needed to write, to pour out the thoughts swirling in my mind before they overwhelmed me. This wasn't just about learning a language, it was about fulfilling a promise I made to my mother in her final days, and one that I couldn't let slip away. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling slightly as I began to write. "Dear Diary," I started. Though the words felt awkward, I crossed them out and started again. "Today is the beginning of something new. I have decided to learn English, not just as a skill, but as a way to honor my mother's memory." I paused, staring at the words, the weight of them sinking in. This was it. I had committed. My mother always dreamed of traveling to an English-speaking country. She used to sit with me at night, reading through old brochures, pointing out the places she wanted to visit. But life, as it often does, got in the way. Illness came before travel, and her dreams remained just that, dreams. Now I carry those dreams with me, hoping that in learning this language, I can somehow bring her closer, even though she's gone. I took a deep breath, my chest tightening as I thought about her, the promise I made to her, and the daunting task ahead of me. English wasn't just a language to me now. It was a bridge to my mother, a way to keep her spirit alive in me. But as I sat there, staring at the page, the enormity of it all hit me like a tidal wave. How would I even start? The grammar, the vocabulary, the endless rules, it seemed impossible. Yet I couldn't back out now. I had promised. That night I opened the first English textbook I could find. I turned to the chapter on grammar and stared at the page, the words swimming in front of my eyes. Present continuous, past perfect, future tense, it all felt like a jumble of nonsense. I tried to focus, but the rules seemed to contradict each other. Every time I thought I understood something, I second-guessed myself. Frustration began to bubble up inside me, and I slammed the book shut. "What am I doing?" I muttered to myself. "How am I supposed to learn this, I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. But then I remembered why I was doing this. It wasn't just for me, it was for her. I couldn't give up, not now, not ever. The next few days were much of the same. I practiced, I studied, and I failed repeatedly, but with every failure came a new lesson, and then one day something unexpected happened. I was in the middle of practicing vocabulary when I confused the words desert and dessert. Instead of feeling frustrated, I burst out laughing. The image of ordering a sandy dessert after dinner was so ridiculous that I couldn't help but chuckle. It was the first time I found humor in the process, and it made the learning feel a little lighter, a little more bearable. As the days went on, I began to notice small victories. The words that once felt foreign started to make sense, slowly but surely. I wasn't fluent by any means, but I was learning, and that was something. Then came the moment I had been dreading, but also anticipating. I decided to test myself by ordering food in English. I remember walking into the small cafe, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached the counter. The menu was in English, of course, and though I had practiced the words, they still felt heavy on my tongue. The cashier smiled at me, waiting patiently as I tried to gather my thoughts. I'll have a coffee, please," I stammered, my hands shaking slightly. The words came out clumsily, but they came out. The cashier nodded and repeated my order, and for a brief moment I felt a surge of pride. I had done it. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. When I got home that night, I opened my diary again and wrote down the entire experience. "I ordered food in English today," I wrote, the excitement still bubbling inside me. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that's what matters. As I closed the diary, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had taken the first step. The road ahead was still long and full of challenges, but for the first time I believed that I could do it. I could learn English, not just for me, but for her. Later that evening, I sat by the window again, the journal opened on my lap. The cafe experience had boosted my confidence, but the real reason behind this journey still weighed heavily on my mind. I closed my eyes and pictured my mother's face, her soft smile, and the way her eyes lit up whenever she talked about her dream of traveling. "I'm doing this for you," I whisper, my voice barely audible. "I won't give up. I promise." As the sun set, casting a warm glow across the room, I realized that this journey was about more than just learning a language. It was about healing, about keeping her memory alive in the only way I knew how. With every new word I learned, every mistake I corrected, I was one step closer to fulfilling that promise. And that, more than anything, gave me the strength to continue. The following morning, I woke up feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. Today, I had set a goal to expand my vocabulary. Basic sentence structure had felt overwhelming. Then memorizing countless new words seemed like an impossible task. Still, I reminded myself of why I was doing this. I couldn't afford to let doubt cloud my mind. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down with my notebook, ready to tackle the day. I opened the language app I had downloaded a few weeks ago, the cheerful chime of the program greeting me as if it had no idea how daunting its tasks really were. The lesson began with a long list of new words, nouns, adjectives, verbs, all swirling together in a confusing mess. I tried to focus on each one, repeating them out loud in an attempt to cement them in my memory. Cat, table, beautiful, run, they all seem simple enough, but as the list grew longer, my mind started to blur. By the time I reached the 10th word, I was exhausted. How can anyone learn all of this? I muttered under my breath, scribbling the words in my notebook. It felt like trying to hold water in my hands no matter how hard I try. Most of it slipped through, but I couldn't give up. I wouldn't. After taking a short break, I returned to the lesson, determined to make sense of this mountain of vocabulary. Slowly, I realized that learning a few words at a time was more manageable than trying to memorize everything at once. I had to remind myself that progress, no matter how small, was still progress. Later that afternoon, I decided to try reading an English text. It was just a short story, something simple that I hope I could follow. I opened the book and stared at the first sentence. My eyes scanned the words, but very little made sense. I could pick out a few familiar terms, but the majority of it was a blur of confusion. I read the sentence again and again, hoping that repetition would help. But with each attempt, frustration gnawed at me. It felt as if I was standing at the base of a mountain, looking up at the seemingly endless climb ahead. I closed the book, fighting back the feeling of defeat. Why is this so hard? I asked myself, though I already knew the answer. Learning a language wasn't supposed to be easy. But knowing that didn't make it any less frustrating. I scribbled a note in my diary that evening, documenting my struggle. Tried reading today, couldn't understand most of it. Feeling discouraged, but I won't give up. Writing it down somehow helped ease the frustration, as if putting my thoughts on paper could lessen their weight. The days that followed were a blur of grammar lessons, vocabulary drills, and more failed reading attempts. There were moments where I felt like I was making no progress at all, like I was stuck in place despite all the effort I was putting in. I called it the grammar plateau, a point where I no longer felt like I was improving, even though I knew I was still practicing. Every day felt the same, no breakthroughs, no significant progress, just more of the same routine. One evening, after another long day of study, I sat down with my diary again, ready to pour out my thoughts. I'm stuck, I wrote. I've been practicing for weeks, but it feels like I'm not getting anywhere. Everything seems stagnant. I stared at the page for a long time before adding, but I promised her I wouldn't quit. That simple reminder, the memory of my mother, and the promise I made was enough to keep me going. Even when the road felt endless, I knew I had to keep walking it. A few days later, I decided to change my approach. If traditional studying wasn't working, maybe it was time to try something new. I began listening to English podcasts and watching TV shows with subtitles. At first, it felt strange hearing the language spoken so quickly and fluently. But over time, I started picking up on phrases and expressions that I hadn't learned in my lessons. It was refreshing, like taking a different path up the same mountain. It didn't make the climb any easier, but it made it more interesting. The podcasts, in particular, became a source of comfort. I would listen to them during my daily routine, absorbing the language while cooking or cleaning. Sometimes I didn't understand everything that was being said, but that was okay. I knew that exposure was part of the learning process, and little by little, things started to click. The words that had once seemed foreign began to feel more familiar. I was starting to understand, even if only a little bit. Then one evening, something extraordinary happened. I was chatting online with a fellow language learner when we decided to practice speaking English together. It was nerve-wracking, knowing that I would have to hold a real conversation in a language I still felt so unsure about. But to my surprise, the words came more easily than I had expected. The conversation was simple, basic introductions, asking about each other's day, but it was more than I had ever managed before. When the conversation ended, I sat back in my chair, my heart racing with excitement. I had done it. For the first time, I had spoken English without feeling completely lost. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was a breakthrough, a sign that I was moving forward, no matter how slowly. I grabbed my diary and wrote down everything that had just happened, the pen flying across the page as I tried to capture the excitement I felt. Had my first real English conversation today, I wrote the words feeling surreal as I put them down. It wasn't flawless, but it was progress. I'm starting to feel like I can actually do this. As I closed the diary, I realized that this was what learning a language was all about. It wasn't just about memorizing words or perfecting grammar. It was about the small victories, the moments when everything clicked, even if only for a brief moment. And those moments, as small as they were, gave me the strength to keep going. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. There would be more challenges, I knew that. But for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to face them. I wasn't just learning English anymore. I was learning perseverance, patience, and the power of persistence. And with each new word, with each new phrase, I was getting closer to fulfilling the promise I had made. I smiled to myself as I drifted off to sleep, knowing that tomorrow was another step forward on this journey, a journey not just of language, but of growth, determination, and love. I woke up to a sense of unease. It had been weeks since I started this journey, but today the weight of it all pressed down on me in a way that I hadn't felt before. The language, once full of possibility, now felt like an insurmountable wall. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that setbacks were normal, that progress wasn't linear. Still, the doubt lingered, whispering in the back of my mind. After breakfast, I decided to tackle a simple reading exercise, hoping that success might lift my spirits. I opened the book, one I had struggled with before, and began to read. The first few lines made sense, and for a moment I felt a spark of hope. But as the sentences grew longer and more complex, my confidence crumbled. The words became a blur, and I found myself reading the same sentence over and over, unable to make sense of it. Frustration bubbled up inside me. I slammed the book shut and pushed it away, my heart pounding with anger. "Why can't I do this?" I muttered to myself, the familiar sting of defeat settling in. I had been trying so hard, putting in the hours, practicing every day. And yet, here I was, struggling with something that seemed so simple on the surface. I grabbed my diary and opened it to a blank page, the pen heavy in my hand. "Bad day," I wrote. "I can't seem to make any progress. I thought I was getting better, but today feels like I've gone backward." I stared at the words, feeling the weight of them settle into my chest. Writing it down helped, but only a little. I knew that setbacks were part of the process, but knowing that didn't make it any less painful. The rest of the day dragged on, each attempt to study feeling more futile than the last. By evening, I had resigned myself to the fact that today wasn't going to be a productive day. I would have to accept it and try again tomorrow. But deep down, the doubt still lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. That night, as I lay in bed, memories of my mother surfaced. I thought about the letter she had written me before she passed, the one I hadn't read in months. It was tucked away in a drawer, a piece of her that I hadn't been ready to confront. But now, with the weight of today's failure pressing down on me, I felt drawn to it. I needed a reminder of why I was doing this, why I couldn't give up. I got out of bed and retrieved the letter, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. Her familiar handwriting greeted me, the words soft and loving, just like her. As I read through it, tears welled up in my eyes. She had always believed in me, always encouraged me to chase my dreams, no matter how difficult they seemed. And now, even though she was gone, her words carried the same strength, the same warmth. "I know you can do this," she had written. "No matter how hard it gets, remember that you are capable of more than you think. I'm proud of you, always." I closed the letter, holding it close to my chest, and let the tears fall. Her belief in me had always been unwavering, and I couldn't let her down. I couldn't let myself down. The next morning I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The doubt was still there, but it was quieter now, overshadowed by the memory of her words. I wasn't going to give up, not today, not ever. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down at my desk, ready to face the day's challenges head-on. Instead of diving straight into another reading exercise, I decided to take a different approach. I opened my diary and read through some of my earlier entries, tracing the journey I had taken so far. I had come a long way, even if it didn't always feel like it. From the first day of struggling with grammar rules to my small victories in ordering food and holding conversations, the progress was there, even if it wasn't always obvious. Reflecting on my journey helped shift my perspective. I wasn't stuck, I was growing. And growth, I realized, wasn't always visible in the day-to-day grind. Sometimes it took stepping back to see the bigger picture. With that in mind, I decided to make a plan. Instead of letting the daily frustrations overwhelm me, I would focus on setting small, achievable goals. Progress would come one step at a time. I started by reviewing my vocabulary list, choosing a handful of words to focus on for the day. I repeated them out loud, wrote them down, and used them in sentences until they felt familiar. It wasn't much, but it was something, and that was enough. Little by little, I felt the heaviness in my chest begin to lift. That afternoon, I decided to revisit the technique that had helped me before listening to English podcasts. I chose a new episode, one that covered a topic I was interested in, and let the words wash over me. At first, it felt overwhelming, the speakers talking too fast for me to keep up, but as I relaxed into it, I began to pick up familiar phrases, recognizing bits and pieces of what was being said. By the end of the episode, I felt a small sense of accomplishment. I hadn't understood everything, but I had understood enough. And that, I reminded myself, was progress. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be better than yesterday. As the sun set, I sat by the window with my diary, ready to document the day's events. Today was better, I wrote. I didn't make huge strides, but I took small steps forward. And that's enough. I paused, staring at the words, feeling the truth of them sink in. Small steps were enough. They had to be. I closed the diary and looked out at the fading light, a sense of calm settling over me. There would be more bad days, I knew that. But there would also be good days where the progress was clear, where the victories, however small, were enough to keep me going. And as long as I kept moving forward, I knew I would get there. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I thought about my mother again. I could almost hear her voice, soft and reassuring, telling me to keep going, to believe in myself the way she had always believed in me. And with that thought in mind, I let the day's struggles fade away, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities for growth. The morning light streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across my desk. As I sat down, I felt a sense of anticipation. Today, I was going to try something different. For weeks, I had been practicing and studying, but today I was ready to test myself in a new way. I reached for a book that had been sitting on my shelf for months, one I had attempted to read before, but had given up on quickly. It felt different this time. I wasn't approaching it with the same hesitation and fear. Instead, I felt ready to see how far I had come. I opened the book, my heart racing slightly as I scanned the first page. At first, the words felt familiar, like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. Sentence by sentence, I read, and to my surprise, I understood more than I ever had before. It wasn't perfect, and there were still parts that tripped me up, but the progress was undeniable. I could feel it. I was finally making sense of something that had once felt impossible. As I turned the pages, I felt a rush of excitement. The confusion that had once clouded my mind was starting to clear. I wasn't just reading words anymore, I was understanding them, connecting them to meaning in a way that I hadn't before. It was as if all the pieces of the language were starting to come together, forming a picture that had once seemed so distant and unattainable. By the time I reached the end of the chapter, I was beaming. I closed the book and sat back, letting the feeling of accomplishment wash over me. This was it. This was what all the hard work had been for. The long nights, the frustrations, the setbacks, it had all led to this moment. I wasn't fluent yet, far from it, but for the first time I felt like I was truly on my way. That afternoon, I decided to share my experience with others. There was a small online community of language learners that I had been part of for a while, and though I didn't participate often, I felt compelled to reach out. I logged in and posted a message about my progress, sharing how I had finally managed to read a chapter of an English book and understand most of it. To my surprise, the responses were overwhelmingly supportive. Other learners congratulated me, some even sharing their own struggles and victories. It felt good to connect with people who were on a similar journey. Their words of encouragement lifted me even higher, reinforcing the sense of accomplishment I already felt. But what stood out to me most were the messages from learners who were struggling just as I had been. They talked about feeling stuck, about how they couldn't seem to make any progress. I could relate to them more than they knew, and in that moment, I realized something important. I had something to offer them. I responded to each message with advice based on my own experience. I shared the methods that had worked for me, like breaking tasks into smaller, manageable steps and finding new ways to immerse myself in the language. It felt strange at first, giving advice to others, but the more I shared, the more I realized how much I had learned. Teaching, in a way, was reinforcing my own understanding of the language. By the end of the day, I felt a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just learning for myself anymore. I was part of a community, and helping others along their journey made mine even more meaningful. I wrote about it in my diary that evening, reflecting on how far I had come and how much further I still had to go. Today, I realized that learning is not just about the destination, I wrote. It's about the journey. And sometimes the best way to move forward is to help others do the same. A few days later, I attended a local event where I knew I would have the chance to practice speaking English. It was a casual gathering, nothing formal, but the idea of engaging in real conversations still made me nervous. I took a deep breath as I walked into the room, reminding myself that this was another step forward, another opportunity to learn and grow. As the evening went on, I found myself in several conversations, each one a little easier than the last. At first, I stumbled over my words, hesitating as I tried to form sentences. But as the night progressed, I began to relax, letting the language flow more naturally. By the end of the event, I had successfully navigated several conversations in English, and though they were far from perfect, they were enough to fill me with a sense of pride. When I returned home that night, I couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't just about the language anymore, it was about the connections I was making, the sense of belonging I felt. For so long, I had viewed learning English as a solitary endeavor, something I had to do on my own. But now I realized that it was about more than just language. It was about connecting with others, sharing experiences, and growing together. As I sat down to write in my diary, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Today I spoke with people in English. I wrote, not perfectly, not fluently, but with confidence, and that's what matters. The more I practice, the more I realize that it's not about getting it right every time. It's about showing up, trying, and learning from the process. The days that followed were filled with moments of reflection. I found myself looking back on the early entries in my diary, remembering how lost I had felt at the beginning of this journey. It was hard to believe how much had changed since then. The struggles were still there, of course, but so were the victories, the small moments of progress that reminded me why I had started this in the first place. I was growing not just as a language learner, but as a person. The lessons I was learning extended far beyond English. I was learning patience, resilience, and the value of persistence. Each challenge, each setback was shaping me, teaching me that growth wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. As the sun set on another day, I wrote one final entry in my diary. Learning a language is like climbing a mountain. I wrote, there are moments when it feels impossible, when the summit seems too far away to reach. But each step, no matter how small, brings you closer. And today I took another step. I closed the diary, feeling a deep sense of peace. There were still challenges ahead, I knew that. But for the first time, I felt ready to face them, not with fear, but with confidence. Each day was a new opportunity to grow, to learn, and to take one more step toward the summit. And with that thought in mind, I went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new victories. The day had finally come. I stood at the airport, my heart pounding in my chest as I clutched my suitcase in one hand and my passport in the other. This was the trip my mother had always dreamed of, the trip I had promised her I would take in her memory. The day felt surreal, like a moment I had imagined countless times, but was now living for the first time. I had worked so hard to get here, and now that it was happening, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This trip wasn't just about visiting a new place. It was the culmination of everything I had been working toward, both for myself and for her. As I boarded the plane, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to this point. It hadn't been easy. There had been countless setbacks, moments when I thought I would never be able to reach this goal. But here I was, about to take the final step toward fulfilling the promise I had made. The plane took off, and I gazed out the window, watching the clouds drift by as we soared higher into the sky. I thought about my mother, imagining how proud she would be if she were here with me. In a way, I felt like she was. The flight was long, but I spent the time reflecting on all the progress I had made. I thought back to the early days of frustration when the language seemed impossible to grasp. The moments of doubt, the endless hours of practice, the small victories that had kept me going, it had all led to this. I opened my journal and began to write, documenting this moment so I could remember how it felt to finally be taking this trip. I'm on the plane, I wrote. Heading to the place we always dreamed of visiting. I can't believe it's really happening. I wish you were here with me. When we landed, I stepped off the plane and into a world that felt both familiar and foreign. I had been practicing English for so long that the language no longer felt intimidating, but the reality of being in an English-speaking country was still overwhelming. Every sign, every announcement, every conversation around me was in English. It was both exhilarating and daunting, but I reminded myself that I was ready for this. I had worked hard to get to this point, and now it was time to put everything I had learned into practice. Navigating the airport was my first challenge, but it went smoother than I had expected. I asked for directions, ordered a coffee, and even chatted briefly with a fellow traveler, all in English. Each interaction, no matter how small, felt like a victory. I wasn't just getting by, I was communicating with confidence. It was a feeling I hadn't imagined I would ever experience when I first started this journey, but now that I was here, it felt natural. As I made my way through the city, I couldn't help but smile at how far I had come. The streets were busy, filled with people speaking a language that had once seemed so foreign to me. But now I could understand them, I could read the signs, follow conversations, and interact with the world around me in a way I never thought possible. It was as if a door had opened, and I was finally able to step through it into a new world of possibilities. One afternoon, I visited a special place my mother had always dreamed of seeing. It was a beautiful park filled with flowers and trees, a place she had talked about so often in her letters. As I walked through the park, I felt a deep sense of connection to her, as if she were walking beside me. I found a quiet bench and sat down, taking in the peaceful surroundings. I reached into my bag and pulled out my journal, the pages now filled with the story of my journey. I'm here, I wrote, in the place you always wanted to visit. It's as beautiful as you imagined. I wish you could see it, but I know you're with me in spirit. I kept my promise, and I'm so proud of how far I've come. The words flowed easily, carrying with them the weight of everything I had been through to reach this moment. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of closure, as if I had finally fulfilled the promise I had made so long ago. That evening, I returned to my hotel room, exhausted but content. The trip had been everything I had hoped it would be, and more. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not just for fulfilling my promise, but for everything I had achieved along the way. Learning English had been more than just a skill, it had been a journey of self-discovery, of perseverance, and of growth. I had learned so much about myself through the process, and I knew that this was only the beginning. Before going to bed, I wrote my final diary entry for the trip. Today was the day I fulfilled my promise. I walked through the park we always dreamed of, and I felt you with me. This journey has been more than I ever expected. It's taught me so much, not just about language, but about life. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, and I know you would be too. But this isn't the end. There's so much more to learn, so much more to experience, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. As I put the journal away, I felt a sense of peace. This chapter of my journey was coming to an end, but I knew that the story was far from over. There would be new challenges ahead, new goals to reach, but I was no longer afraid of them. I had proven to myself that I could do hard things, that I could keep going even when the road seemed long and uncertain. The next morning, as I prepared to leave for the airport, I took one last look at the city that had once seemed so far out of reach. I felt a sense of gratitude for everything I had learned along the way and for the promise that had brought me here. I knew that my mother would be proud of what I had accomplished, and that thought filled me with warmth. As I boarded the plane to return home, I felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength and determination to keep going, no matter what challenges lay ahead.